So today we're going to talk about Egypt. And most people think about Egypt and think of the pyramids and other sort of monumental architecture that's pretty readily visible from an airplane. These monuments didn't appear out of nothing. They did develop from an ideological and cultural system that required their building and their existence to help control society. So in this lecture, we're going to think about pre-dynastic Egypt and then the Old Kingdom. And these are sort of two periods of time that that follow one another. Dynasty is a type of chronological label that implies a family rule. So in Egypt, we have evidence of humans from about 8800 until the present time. And early inhabitants of Egypt were hunter-gatherers or foragers, just like in pretty much everywhere else in the world. And they exploited the river valley because it flooded yearly. The Nile actually flows from the south to the north, so it ends up in the Mediterranean Sea. It doesn't start from there. And it flows from mountains in Ethiopia. So every year it snows, and then when the snow melts, the river floods. And this flooding creates a really nice fertile plain around the Nile River for animals to come and eat and for humans to hunt and also gather plants, plant remains, fruits, things like that. Just like everywhere else, people eventually settled in Egypt and began having long-term camps, which eventually led into towns and things like that. So the image on your screen right now is basic dates for some of the important periods of history. So we're not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about every site that I have listed as an important place on this chart, just to get a general idea of the kind of dating or the dynasty associated with that date. So we will start in about the sort of late Neolithic, early Chalcolithic period, move into the early dynastic, and talk about the Old Kingdom. So for our purposes, we're really going to stop at about the 2100s BCE. And if you're interested, there is plenty of literature on the internet for these later periods of Egypt. We just don't really have time for them. So as I said before, the Nile does flow from south to north, and that means the Nile is divided into two regions, generally called Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. And confusingly, Upper Egypt is in the south, and Lower Egypt is in the north. Try to keep that straight, because occasionally I will say Upper or Lower Egypt, and you'll have to kind of know what I'm talking about. On these maps, I have some of the important early dynastic and pre-dynastic sites. So the picture on the right has a site called Nakata and Abydos and Hierakonpolis, and these sites become really important as we sort of build up to the Old Kingdom. The other map basically just shows the whole of sort of Egypt and its southern neighbor, which was called Kush or Nubia in prehistory. This would be modern Sudan. The Nile River does have several sections of rapids, and these are called cataracts. And in the early periods of history, the first cataract becomes kind of important, and as time goes on, other cataracts become important for the ruling of Egypt. These end up being sort of tax locations for people using the river. So let's get started. We will start with the pre-dynastic period. So this goes from 8800 to about 2920 BCE. And for this period, the bulk of the archaeological remains are tomb-based. There are some sites that have some settlement. But the reason we don't find a lot of settlement evidence in earlier periods of history in Egypt is because settlements are built in the same location that modern cities are built. So they're built basically right along the Nile. And so when people consistently live in one place, they build over and over and over and over again in the same location. So it's hard to find settlement data because it's probably underneath the modern towns. So cemeteries in Egypt are always outside of city limits. So thankfully we have some tomb data to make inferences about human behavior and try to understand sort of the way hierarchy and state society developed in Egypt. So we'll start with the site of Madi. And Madi is of about 3900 to 3200 in date, so it's firmly in the Chalcolithic period. And at this particular site, so Madi is actually in Lower Egypt, which means that it is in the northern part, sort of near the Nile Delta. This is important because the Delta might have been a region of early trade. There's lots of water coming in at this, flowing out into the ocean at this point, and there's lots of places to have trade ports and things like that. So while humans didn't have big dramatic ships at this time in order to travel far distances via the ocean, they probably would have traded using the tributaries of the Nile into the Mediterranean to trade between villages. So on your screen are some photos from the site of Madi, including where it is along the Nile. This is luckily one of the sites we have a little bit of settlement for, and this is lucky because we have our first evidence of a stone-built house. So earlier sites and sites of contemporary date don't have sort of subterranean foundation levels. They don't use stone. They seem to be built entirely out of what's called mud brick, which is basically just dirt and water mixed together and baked in the sun. So Madi is important for this stone-built architecture and the existence of sort of subterranean level. So in the photo on the top right, you can see that there are some post holes inside of this house. So that would have been evidence of however they roofed the structure. Some suggestions include, you know, a standard kind of reeds or other vegetative material, which is pretty standard for Neolithic and Chalcolithic populations. There's no sort of roof tiles like we find in much, much later periods, Roman and medieval, things like that. Also at Madi, we have evidence of early agriculture, so they harvested barley and emmer wheat. They also have some evidence of storage jars and storage pits, so they were definitely farming and keeping things for sort of a long term. We know that they were eating cattle, goat, and sheep because we found these kinds of bones on the site, plus also dog bones. So as we learned last week, or actually earlier this week in a previous lecture, the emmer and barley and things like that are pretty standard for this sort of early agricultural evidence. Also at Madi, there's not really any standardization in house shape. We have oval shapes, we have round shapes, and we have square or rectangle shapes. So they didn't seem to be particularly picky about what their houses looked like. So if you remember the Natufian stuff, they were really set on the round structure. Here, of similar date, not quite so much. So if we move to another site, a site called Al-Badari, often called the Badarian culture. This is one of our first really strong agricultural centers. So there's a lot more evidence of agriculture here. It dates from about 4400 to 4000 BCE. And Badarian culture is nice because they have a very characteristic pottery. So we are now making sort of fine wares. Sites like Madi wouldn't have had a lot of fine wares. They were more utilitarian, kind of plain, thick, coarser pottery. In the Badarian culture, they start making this tall beaker-looking thing with a black top and a red fabric. And so these kinds of goods are very characteristic of Badarian culture, and it's a good way to recognize people who shared similar cultural beliefs. So the Badarian culture is defined entirely by tombs, which is pretty standard. Inside of some of these tombs we have combs, jewelry, figurines, like the figure here on the page. And we are pretty certain that this female figurine is kind of a tradition of more broadly used in the Near East. Around this time, we have a lot of evidence of female figurines appearing in the archaeology of Egypt, Turkey, Syria, Mesopotamia. And these female figurines might be some sort of recognition of the importance of fertility rituals, or they might represent some kind of goddess. And There's lots of theories about the existence of these particular figurines. It's just important to know that they are found also in Egypt. So moving a little more modern in date, not that 4000 BCE is modern, but then we move into what we call the Naqada phase. And Naqada sites are, again, all tomb-based. As you can tell on this page, the pot to the left looks very similar to the Badarian culture pottery, so we think that the Badarian culture evolved into Naqada culture. Naqada is found in Upper Egypt on sort of the first cataract of the Nile, so the first sort of bend in the river where the rapids happen. This site is actually rather famous because Flinders Petrie excavated here, and he used a certain typological analysis of pottery to come up with dates for the site. A typology is how we think about relative dating of pottery. So we'll say, you know, this pot came first, and we can name a whole series of pot dates based on a typology. And we can also organize different styles according to a typology. So this is very common in archaeology. So on this page, the bottom right photo shows 3 different pots. And all of these pots are used by Petrie to date the sites as Naqada 1, 2, and 3. So they go from kind of basic pot with no handle to a pot with a sort of stylized handle of just a design, and then to a pot that's sort of much larger and has an actual handle on it. And he used this to date the different periods in the tombs. This has been tested actually in more recent times and found to be actually accurate in terms of production and materials and things like that. So that's pretty exciting. Here we have a little bit more detail on this slide about this kind of dating. It's actually called sequence dating or seriation. And this kind of dating shows patterns that are entirely always show up as sort of a battleship curve. So if you look at the picture on the left, the middle pot seems to look like a battleship shape. And basically that means in seriation dating that all pots of that type sort of come into existence, become very popular, and then sort of fade out as another pot becomes more popular. And so this is how Petrie sort of did the dating for Naqada 1, 2, and 3. And so he found that they seem to flare, you know, a specific style seemed to flare in popularity and then sort of dwindled. And then he found another style that flared in popularity and then sort of dwindled, things like that. Other people do this all over the world. In fact, in New England, someone did seriation dating to see sort of the frequency and the popularity of different tombstones in sort of the 1800s to 1900s. And that's one of the more famous seriation exercises from our region. So if we go back and think about these Naqada 1, 2, and 3 phases, they've been described as Naqada 1 is kind of very Badarian in style. Even the tombs look very similar. Naqada 2 is then seen as kind of a transition or maybe a revolution of style and a change in culture. And then Naqada 3 becomes sort of the after effects of this revolution. And in fact, tomb styles change quite dramatically between Naqada 1 and 3. So during the sort of end period of Naqada 3, we seem to have a lot of evidence of an increase in ideas of hierarchy. So some of the tombs become very elaborate and have a lot of grave goods in them. And this is really our transition into sort of the kind of early dynastic period of Egypt, where we actually have the existence of chiefdoms. And so a chiefdom setup is where there is one person who's in control of everybody else. So this chief organizes trade, organizes sort of the building of new things, the government, the taxes, things like that. So a chiefdom society is starting to develop, we think, here at the end of the Naqada period, so about 3200 BCE. Our sort of best example of this early transitional phase is there at Nakata, and then also at a site called Hierakonpolis. Hierakonpolis is a little bit further south than Nakata, so it's still in Lower Egypt, and now we're a little bit south of that first cataract. So Hierakonpolis really seems to show sort of differentiation in identities and status levels in its material culture. This site is actually very large and dates from about 3400 to 2575 BCE. There are a ton of tombs at this site, and we actually have some evidence of settlement from a little bit later in dating. So in the tombs of Hierakonpolis, we have a lot of evidence of items that would have been traded around at this time period. So we have some silver and gold that would have come from farther south and also east. And there's also some evidence of copper, oils and wines, and things like that, all found in the tombs here. Hierakonpolis is also a really neat site because here we have evidence of a lot of animals being mummified. So you're probably already familiar with the concept of mummification in Egyptian religion. And in fact, this site is really interesting because they mummified crocodiles, birds, goats, cats, even some baby elephants. So for their sort of religious tradition at this point, animals were very important. Animals are almost always related to gods of some kind because many Egyptian gods are have sort of animal and human characteristics. So for example, one of the gods of sort of the dead of the underworld has a dog head. And then one of the gods who is sort of used in images of kings in this early period, and chiefs probably, is the god Horus, and he has an eagle's head with a human body. So mummifying all of these animals and burying them in tombs is probably a way to respect the gods and recognize sort of the god's role in your afterlife. So also important at Hierakonpolis is this particular tomb called Tomb 100, and it has a pretty elaborate painting in it. There's a small clip or cutout of this painting on the left side of this slide. And in this Tomb 100, there's a lot of imagery that makes us see that, you know, certain symbols and images might represent a change in society, might represent elites or kings. More evidence of this is the fact that we know that different towns were becoming allied at this period. So we have the idea of confederations in the south here near the first cataract of the Nile. And these confederations were groups of towns that would have all united and probably traded amongst each other and then traded with other confederations. These confederations represent perhaps a type of unifying. So perhaps there was one person in charge of each of these confederations, so that would have been even more advanced than a chiefdom society at this point. And we think this is our first step really into unifying Egypt. And within this area is another very important tomb site called Abydos. And Abydos dates from about 3000 to 2650 BCE. And it is north of the first cataract, but still within that confederation area. At Abydos, we have huge differentiation in tomb design. So we have some that are very large, like the one shown here called Tomb UJ, and others that are very small with almost no tomb goods whatsoever. And so this kind of differentiation really shows us that there's a dramatic hierarchy being formed at this point. And we also think that this is, like Tomb 100 at Hierakonpolis, early signs of ideas of unification, ideas of royalty, of some kind of kingship, and things like that. So based on evidence from Abydos and from Hierakonpolis and also some other artifacts, we have this question of, okay, when Egypt is finally unified, who actually did it? So on this slide, I'm showing you some evidence of possible first kings of Egypt. Um, we're not sure exactly who was first to unify Egypt. Maybe it was one person with three names, but that might be a little less likely. So we have three names. We have the name Scorpion, which comes from Tumujay from Abydos. So that was that big 12-room tomb from that last slide. We have the name Narmer that comes from a basalt palette, and he has a lot of sort of kingship iconography, so the Horus bird and things like that. And then we also have the name Menes, which comes from the Turin Canon, and the Turin Canon is just a list of names of kings that was found in a much later time period in a different part of Egypt, but has the name of, the first king of Egypt as Menes. And we don't really have a lot of evidence for Menes. We might have a small figurine here on the left side of the screen. And again, each of these possible unifiers only have like one artifact associated with them. So it's pretty difficult to determine who's our unifier. However, from an anthropological standpoint, I'm not sure it really matters who actually unified Egypt. I think what matters is that at this time we come up with a bunch of sort of icons and symbols that represent kingship. And we're going to talk about that next here. So, kingship iconography. These are things that seem to be found in a whole bunch of places that seem to represent a ruler. And some of these iconographic images come from Mesopotamia. Some of them seem to have just come out of existence in Egypt. On this screen, I have a line drawing of the Narmer palette. So the first thing is the Horus bird, which there's an arrow pointing to. And the Horus bird is sort of a representation of the god Horus, who seems to be the favored god for early kingship. And the Horus bird is actually standing on what looks like a fan, but it is a bunch of heads on like a pole. So that sort of goes with the iconography of smiting one's enemies. So on the right side at the top there's a bunch of dead enemies. On the bottom of the left side there's a dead enemy. In the middle where Narmer is standing, he's actually actively smiting an enemy. So this smiting of enemies is also very important. We also have the iconography of the taming of animals. So on the right side there are two guys that are like holding the necks of these super creatures, or I believe they're griffins. And so, being the master of animals is also important. And then finally, Narmer here is wearing a particular type of crown, and this crown represents the unification of Egypt. So it's a combination of headpieces we see in Upper and Lower Egypt around this time. There's a couple other things that seem to show up as well. So in Tomb 100, we also have a lot of Master of Animals, and also on mace head that we found. So a mace head is like a big metal ball that you use to smite people, hit them, things like that. We have a representation of something called the Hebsed Festival, and the Hebsed Festival is a commemoration of a king after he dies. So every year on the anniversary of his death, you go and visit him, you bring him food and other gifts, and so you present these items to sort of the figurine of him at his burial site. And there's a representation of this on a mace head that also has an image of the King Narmer on it. This Hebsed festival becomes important also in the Old Kingdom. And then finally we have an incense burner from much farther south, actually outside of Egypt entirely. It's from Nubia, that has some of these images on it as well, the Master of Animals and things like that. There's also a particular type of scepter. I just brought you back to the Abydos page so we could see the scepter here. It's called a Heka scepter, and it's Heqa. And this scepter is often held by or associated with kings in this early dynastic and even later dynastic period. So finally, our early dynasties are really not happy time in Egypt. There's a lot of war happening. There's a lot of changing of hands. So in order to try to keep Egypt unified, kings would marry their children to rulers in other places in Egypt to try to keep the peace. So recognizing that someone else has power outside of your exact domain, and then marrying a child off to that person recognizes that person's power and then sort of encourages them to fall in line, I suppose. They're also trying to establish a religious ideology at this point based around the idea of Horus as associated with kings, and that when kings die, they become part of the Egyptian pantheon of gods, and they sort of take on the role of Osiris, who is a god of the underworld. And then finally, one of our best examples of just using language and text, because we actually do have hieroglyphics at this point, is the last king of Dynasty 2 called himself the appearance of two powers, so recognizing that there's still a divide between Upper and Lower Egypt, and that he's sort of the embodiment of the two of them together. And then he called his wife, the king-bearing mother, so that she would be sort of recognized for her role as providing the next king of that dynasty. And he renamed everybody in order to encourage cooperation. So this is sort of the state of Egypt when we start the Old Kingdom. And the Old Kingdom is really the most dramatic shift into extreme hierarchy and sort of a very advanced religious ideology.